Science for Everyday Decisions, series by Center for Sustainable Development at the Earth Institute, Columbia University. For your consideration for a more sustainable life through education for sustainable development.
Hi, Frank. This is very opportune and actually very timely to be discussing these things with you. Thanks for joining our discussion on the role of education in sustainable development. And since I feel very pessimistic today, so maybe I should add, what is the role of education in sustainable development, and is there a role? So we'll discuss some questions with you. Just a quick background, and please feel free to add. You are the Clean Leadership Board co-chair at the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network, and also work as the Climate Education Coordinator at NOAA's Climate Program Office. So as per your job description, what are the things that you do critically in terms of shaping this climate education discussion globally?
Sure. So let me add a couple more dimensions to my job that are germane to this conversation, especially because of the international dimension of this work. So in addition to those two positions, I also am the reporting lead for Article 6, or ACE for Climate Empowerment for the United States government. So in the 2010 and 2014 national communications, I lead the process of our ACE, Action for Climate Empowerment, part of the U.S. response for the national communications. In addition to that, I was on the COP21 Paris Agreement delegation for the United States government representing education and youth. So under the UN climate change treaty process, Article 6 of the original treaty really stipulates that countries should collaborate under that article. And so part of why I think this is important is because, education is one of those, and when I mean education, I'm talking about education, training, public outreach, public participation, the whole aspects, all the dimensions of it are crucial to what nations, communities are doing to address climate change effectively. So, that's part of my responsibilities. But then also, I lead historically more so than now the federal interagency process for climate education in the United States. So that there's a lot of dimensions to this. This is a very complicated enterprise that we're talking about. Just education alone is a very large set of organizations and institutions. Whether you're talking about universities, colleges, pre-college, community college, K-12, formal, informal, non-formal, place-based, it's massive. My estimation is that just in the United States alone, we're talking about north of a $2 trillion enterprise that interacts with almost every person in the country on an annual basis. And then through media and communications and other modalities and outreach and web, it's a very significant, sizable organization. That's just in the United States, but the part that trying to figure out how education works in how humans are responding to climate change, the last number of years we've dug into this, and what we have found is while it was in the original treaty that it should be there in all its forms, it hasn't really been seriously explored as a capability or a pillar of what supports actions in communities. It's kind of a nice thing, but it's not really central. Well, our analysis shows that it is actually central. If you're going to change everything as a result of addressing climate change, food, agriculture, transportation, energy production, land use, that's what has to change in order to address climate change. You cannot do that without education. It's impossible. You can't do it without training. It's impossible. So trying to do these things without them is impossible. And so if we're serious about addressing this under the Paris targets or the SDGs, education actually needs to be a central strategy, not a peripheral strategy. And the more communities are really getting into the hard work of addressing climate impacts and climate solutions, they're becoming more and more aware of this limiting factor. If they don't have a broad-based public support and will and capacity, then they're not going to achieve those goals. So that was a long-winded way of saying a little bit.
No, I think this is fantastic, and it leads me to my question, which is I feel that there is this communication of climate crisis or climate change, which is it a new field, or sometimes it's more journalistic, whereas education formally you would see it as school-based education or college-based education. You have like like Columbia has Masters of Sustainability Development programs that have come up not recently, like 10 years back or
Right.
so. So do you think that these are all aspects of education, or is there something which is overlapping, or are we now trying to give this message of climate change to the masses, and so you require all different types of education to be in effect?
So there are a couple things. One is it's not new. It's not new, but it is definitely much more central. Um, I just was at in the United States at the Academy of Natural Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine yesterday at the Board of Science Education, talking about the landscape analysis of climate change education in the United States. And from my analysis, I call it the 5 waves. And the oldest wave I have found is back in the 70s. So that, it was different, it operated differently, but a lot of the dimensions of educational work show up over and over again. It'll surge and then it'll fall back. It'll surge and it'll fall back. The 5th wave that we are just kind of finishing down, and then I see the building of the 6th wave is really started in 2008. It can go back maybe to 2006 or 7, but that wave has some unique properties, and the magnitude and the amplitude, those are the same thing. The wavelength and the amplitude, right, are different. But the work has a lot of attributes that show up, because I think that education about climate change is a natural emergent property that shows up with educators. You talk to any educator, what are they're focused on is building skill and knowledge and abilities for future generations. That's what they're about. And so when you start looking at these large issues that are showing up in the landscape of the future, it naturally calls education of all forms into focusing on this issue. And so, that has shown up over time. And I think that, while communication is a very powerful tool, what's happening now with learners is that they're wanting to go from, I understand a problem enough, to now I really want to build skill to address the problem in all its forms. And so, that is one of the really interesting properties of this current work, is that people are moving from problem to solution very fast. And it's frustrating a lot of students right now. They really want much more time and focus and skill development on addressing problems effectively than they do with really deeply understanding the problem. So I would just say that this is a natural thing that shows up in education over and over and over and over again over time. But there are some unique elements that make this time very different than past times.
And have you
And
seen?
one other important point there is, what also makes this time different is we saw this when we were working under the White House very strongly in the last administration, was youth. Youth engagement, youth leadership, youth activism. But the activism is interesting, right? Because it's not just, protest and on the street. If you just think it's that, you've missed what's going on. They're going into careful deliberations with community leaders of all forms and really calling for a new agenda and willing to roll up their sleeves and work to make that agenda happen, because it's a whole set of new capacities that these are new skills that aren't really prevalent in communities right now, businesses. And so you're from Columbia and the university. And, you know, the students, if you walk around the campus, you talk with students there, they're really grabbing different classes and internships and putting them together in important ways to be ready to accelerate climate actions broad-based. And so that is a form of, it may have been inspired by activism, but the hard work to take the courses and get the majors and minors and certifications actually are critical to our success when we turn our full attention to these solutions.
And so I see that in Colombia, what is now, and you've hinted upon this also, is that it has become much more problem based rather than theory based, and so it requires a professor who needs to be much more aware about a lot of different dimensions. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that has become very challenging, or is there a new trend? So because if you take any sustainable development problem, it has so many different dimensions. It has a social dimension, it has economic dimension, it has a peace, justice dimension, environment dimension. Have you seen that kind of a trend that is emerging, where you take up any issue, but it goes beyond the dimensions of courses? So
Yeah.
how should we lead to, so where is environmental education going? Is it becoming much more of a sustainable development issue, where we are not just dealing with science education, but also different aspects of environment and its challenges?
But I would even extend that further, right? Because it's the what we're looking at is much bigger than environment, because it is a natural security issue, it is a jobs issue, it is a public health issue, it is a economy issue, it is an equity issue. It, you know, just keep on going down the list. And so it is much bigger than environmental education. While environmental education does show us some early work on how to do transdisciplinary education. I think, you know, there are many fields that naturally have gone transdisciplinary for a very long time. So, you know, the work of the environmental education, they naturally always knew they needed to go transdisciplinary. But now when you're dealing with national security or business, so you have business majors at Columbia, I'm assuming.
Yes.
And so I would imagine that the business majors need to take much more coursework in, say, climate change. Because if you don't understand the carbon cycle and exactly how it works and how you can quantify, because one of the largest issues that many sectors are going to have to deal with is, how do they figure out how to decarbonize their sector and have a working sector and a working decarbonization process simultaneously. So, you know, a colleague of mine, the head of science education for Washington State in the United States, was talking to us yesterday about that when they're doing a large statewide climate change education initiative, and they went to the port of Seattle. And they were basically saying, and part of that, I guess, is the airport. They're saying that future people working at the sectors at the airport in Seattle must understand decarbonization. That is, you know, like people working at an airport. What? You have to have deep skill in decarbonization, because the society is going to demand the decarbonization eventually. It's going to be uneven for now. Eventually it'll be much more broad-based, and then eventually it'll be everywhere. But the idea that people working at an airport must be skilled in decarbonization and understanding where carbon is coming from and going, and how do we actually achieve these goals, the society will demand based on science. So it's moving beyond just the science very rapidly. And those are different skills than what currently people working at airports have. Very different.
Very interesting example. So my next question is regarding, like, what are the common misses in the current climate education approaches? Do you think that there are certain gaps that you see?
Yeah. Well, there's definitely, yes, absolutely. We can do way better. We've come a long way, but we can definitely, there are areas that we have to do much better in. One of them is time. Students are frustrated. Learners, let's use learners, because all education does not happen in a formal context. In fact, that's one of the biggest areas where we need to make progress is, coherence. Relevance, we've got relevance. The relevance of this issue is massive. However, the coherence is not. And so learning happens in many places a long time. And so one of the things that students are, and I would imagine this is true for learners, is they're not getting enough time on this. So, there's an example of a professor I was working with in California recently, and he was saying that he's got students who are juniors in college. They're deep into their what they're going to do with their degree, what kind of job they're going to take on in 2 years. They hit a climate change class, and they feel completely blindsided because this is the first time that they have finally understood this issue deeply, because it's a class only on climate change. It's not like a unit in 7th grade for a week and that really kind of like you can gloss over it, really not understand it, and move on. So they feel like I should have known this much earlier. This is really important. I'm surprised that nobody gave this to me earlier. And it takes a much longer amount of time to really deeply understand all the dimensions of this work. It's massive. And so, what's critical and what happens from kindergarten that is age appropriate all the way through, formal education to higher education, to lifelong learning, to community-based learning, time is one of the most important pieces, and we must dedicate ourselves across any modality of education to putting appropriate amounts of time for our learners and our students, because it takes time, and it's so important for the future of what we're trying to do as humanity. So time is important. But the other thing is, it's not just science. It's much bigger than that. It requires multiple dimensions to coherently, that's part of the coherence idea, is that it has to have multiple dimensions. History, critically important. How did we get to here? Well, why did humanity do what it did? And how has it moving forward? What can we learn from the past about addressing these issues about going forward? History has a huge role. Social sciences, civics, economics, math, just keep on going. I don't think there's a single human educational discipline that does not have something to bear on this issue. But what we do know is that if we don't intentionally bring them together for our learners and students, they're going to isolate knowledge and skills and not see how they work together effectively. Learning theory is very clear on these points, right? Coherence is so important, but unless you put a skill in a new instance, it doesn't naturally transfer across. And so you'll think it's just for this situation as opposed to it transfers across. So transdisciplinary learning, critically important. Time is critically important. But the last part I would say is leadership. If we're going to change everything, you need people who have the deep skill to lead the change. Not everybody knows how to lead change. And if you don't know how to lead change, you could call for change, but change won't happen. And that leadership is not at the highest level of organizations or institutions. And it's broad-based. And just because you have a title doesn't make you a leader. Leaders come in many forms. And then the last dimension I would say is that it needs to be inclusive and equitable. Because there's a lot of this that is what we're talking about that is not happening for everyone. Everyone has a right to know and understand this work deeply so that they can bring their talents, their capabilities, and service to their communities to the maximal effect. So, those would be the dimensions that I think we can strengthen. And then the last one, sorry, I think about this a lot, is we have to do it together. We have to collaborate. And so, one of the other dimensions of my job is at the international level, CLEAN is a domestic, for the most part, network of climate and energy literacy professionals. And I'm a co-founder and current co-chair and funder of that. But that work is important, but it only becomes even more important when you move to the international dimension. And so under the UN process, they've tried to organize this some, but the practitioners who are doing exactly what we're talking about are all over the world. And we in the United States are doing some amazing, important work, but that doesn't mean that the solution to any one program comes from within the United States. It could come from Sri Lanka, it could come from Indonesia, it could come from Kenya. And so building stronger international and domestic collaborations at a community scale, at a national scale, and an international scale is a critical priority. We are right now finishing up the Doha Work Program under the United Nations process and reviewing it and looking at recommendations for the future. And one of the recommendations I'm putting forth is that the deepening the network structures and architectures for collaboration under the Article 6 principle is a really, really important element, right? Because if we don't know, a practice could emerge as really effective and it is transferable, but is not transferred because there isn't any mechanism to transfer it. And relying on nation states to do that process is very, very complicated. I mean, just the fact that we're using this technology here, we could use a WhatsApp collaboration in Africa just as easily between a practitioner and a tribal community in northern North Dakota and in Tibet without any trouble, right? So flattening the network architectures so that there could be much more collaboration is a really, really important priority as well. Sorry, that was a lot.
I'm so glad that you mentioned this collaboration and global education program getting other countries involved, because I feel that there is this big disconnect between the global discourse as well as the local issue.
Yep.
The deep decarbonization policies and framework become so distant to me if I am living in India and if I am living in a village. How is that going to really reflect in my day-to-day operations and my day-to-day life? So for example, I'm working on this fluoride and water issue in Western India. None of this, fluoride is a big problem in that region, but the textbooks, school textbooks and other primary education, secondary education don't carry it, whereas they will carry other very generic concepts. So I feel that there is this big disconnect between locally, my lived reality is very different. Even though I'm impacted by climate change, I'm not taught about this in school, but I live that reality, whereas I'm given this other general discussion that yes, climate change is impacting everyone. And so how do I as an actor, and how do I as like a and maybe there will be another collaborator who will be in Ethiopia who will have a different issue, but we need to somehow have a similar language and agree on similar things. And is that even possible?
Absolutely, it's possible. But it requires skilled process, and it requires staff and architectures to actually facilitate that. It does not happen. Remember, one of the titles I carry is I'm a coordinator. So I'm like a carpenter. Everything's a nail. So you're going to naturally hear a coordinator's thoughts. I've been a coordinator here at NOAA for 14 years. So, but if you don't have people who really are good at building bridges and building tools to facilitate bridges that allow that conversation to go back and forth, because I think one of the things we're talking about the UN SDGs, and the SDG 13 is the one on climate change. So right now under the SDG indicators, a lot of the Paris Agreement indicators sit under SDG 13. But obviously SDG 13 has an education dimension to it. SDG 4 is the education SDG. But these are related things. But what even's, I think, more important here is, like I said earlier, educators naturally come to this work over time, not because the UN has an SDG goal framework, not because the Paris Agreement prioritized education in certain ways. It's not why it happens. And so the ability for us to find common language so that we can actually talk to each other and understand, I am doing something that is important to what you are doing, because the goal you're using in Western India is not how do we implement SDG 11. That's
Mhm.
not why it's happening.
True.
Right. So there's a translational, I mean, we need common frameworks. That's what SDGs are, and I have full support for them. But what we need in addition to that is when you're working with people who don't spend a lot of time in this UN process language, it's a jargon. Jargons are just shorthand language for practitioners of a certain focus. So we need to work actively to, in order for that to happen though, there have to be people who are dedicated to that work, that translational work. They're a bridge. They're ambassadors. You know, they allow things to flow between contexts. And if that doesn't happen, you know, I wouldn't expect much transfer of practice.
Mhm.
And, you know, sharing and learning is really the principle of it, right? I have something that you might benefit from. I am interested in learning about what you're doing because it might benefit what I'm doing. That's the root human process. And so how do we facilitate that? That is an important thing to focus on, but it has to be resourced sufficiently in order for it to be successful when you're talking about potentially 7+ billion people. That's a complicated architecture to think through, but it's a worthy thing to focus on. Absolutely.
Mhm. You mentioned SDG 4 and specifically SDG 4.7, which talks about global citizenship.
Yeah.
How is that target going to help or not help in the zero emission for by 2050? Do you think that there are some aspects of education that and under the SDGs, maybe goal 4 is still very separate from climate change and climate related discussions, or do you see that there is a convergence at the local level, international level, and especially with your work? Do you see that the goals are coming together, or are we still living in the MDG era where everything was so separate and we were all siloed?
Okay. We can't have silos. We don't have time for that. That inefficiency has to be completely removed as quickly as possible. So in the work that we're doing, which is principally focused on education and climate. But what's interesting about that is that we are not operating that we are, you know, so I'm looking at a document here. So if you see me looking sideways, that's what it is. But, you know, SDG 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. And SDG, you know, target, you know, under the SDG indicators initiative has targets for, the objective 13.3, and it totally relates to education. But then there's also, if you think about, you know, SDG 12, ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. 11, make cities and human settlements safe, inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. 4, ensure inclusive, equitable, quality education, promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. 2, end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. And 1, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Those are all nested together. They're completely nested together. And operating without them nested together is going to miss the point. So we're looking at 7 SDGs.
But 7 SDGs is education bringing all of them together, or are we saying that we are speaking a different language? I want to know that.
Yeah, sure. So what I say is goal 1, 2, 4, 11, 12, 13, and 17 together operate a framework for what we do. You know, it's 7 of the 17. It's not that the other ones aren't related, they're just less directly related. And so if you're, I mean, what over the last 14 years in the United States, the focus on an equitable and just transition to a low carbon and resilient future, that's new language, right? Because you can't propagate inequities as you change everything. Right, so that brings in a different dimension to I don't remember which SDG it was. It might be 11 or 12, but you know, you're working at a city and community scale. That's a different SDG. Your SDG 17, strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development, and that's more about partnerships and strategies and of those partnerships, right? So that's, you're starting to see, like, you know, some of them are mechanistic and some of them are showing that this is a a problem and a set of solutions that have to happen together in order for it to really work comprehensively. You can't just focus on one piece, SDG 13 in my case, or SDG 4. We started at 4 and 13, but then you start looking carefully and you see that there are actually a wider set of SDGs that relate to each other. But I think the at the bottom, this work that's happening in communities in the United States, I don't think is unique, is that you have to unite them, but you can't use the language of SDGs in the work, but at the same time, as signatory countries to the SDG goals, and the United States is one of those, we must be able to do the work using the language of community and the work and of the community, for the community, by the community, but be able to translate it backward for reporting. And it also gives the ability to see, oh, I'm really working on something in SDG 4. I need to see who's doing work in the United States on 4, but the reason they're doing it is not 4. So there's like coding that says that is really SDG 4. I know you don't come from that. I know you don't use that, but somebody has to identify it, tag it, connect it to SDG 4 and related goals in order for people to see it when they're looking for SDG 4. So that's just the nature of the work, right? These are big, complicated human endeavors. But again, I just want to emphasize that the reason why we are doing these things is not because the UN asked us to do it, but the UN allows us the ability to collaborate and share practice internationally if we have a unifying framework that we translate our work into.
Great. I think you and I can keep discussing this all day. I can keep asking you questions, and
Keep going, let's go.
It has just been so fascinating. And thank you for spending some time with us, Frank. This has really been a pleasure, and you've given at least me a lot of things to think of and shape my international education work. So thanks a lot for spending this time, and I hope we can trouble you further later on and ask you questions over email, and maybe there'll be a quick Q&A session with some of our audiences.
I very much appreciate this work. The more this is the good work, right? Where we are able to really try and understand, and I think in the spirit of Article 6, Element 6, which is collaboration, because it is crucial that if we have done something that is of merit, or we have a need that is significant, that we look not just to our community or to our nation, but to the international community, and to be of service in sharing, or in requesting support because somebody has more advanced work, or they've got a dimension that they're ahead of you, and they are willing to share that back with you. And that simple human, like this conversation, right? This conversation is a fine example of that, where we're going back and forth, trying to understand each other, and in a spirit of collaboration. Sure, we could talk all day, absolutely. I imagine that we're not going to.
Yes. Thank you so much, Frank. It's really been a pleasure talking to you.